What is going on, guys, and welcome back to another video. Today's video is something really different from what I'm used to. I usually, hold the camera or we're installing something or just things along those lines, but today we're actually going to be talking about gauges. For any of you guys who have a modified car or know anything about modified cars, you often see aftermarket gauges somewhere on the car, near the tachometer, up on the A-pillar, right on the dash, somewhere. There's gauges. The purpose of gauges is to monitor things that you can't normally see when the car is running. When you do aftermarket modifications, you want to know how the car is running, so you buy gauges to tell you to do so. Now, gauges are pretty expensive, and if you've ever looked at AEM, their gauges are 150 plus. So they're very expensive gauges, very nice gauges, and they work. And if you run a wideband air-to-fuel ratio gauge, you buy an AEM. That's what you do. But there's often a brand of gauges that gets tossed around, and that is Glowshift. So if you guys don't know what Glowshift is, it is a gauge company that manufactures aftermarket gauges for your car. And the thing that a lot of people notice about them is they're very cheap in comparison to other gauges on the market. Some of their gauges can run as little as $40 up to $150-ish for their wideband air-to-fuel ratio gauge. But a lot of people say they aren't good or they suck, and it does get you thinking when you see an aftermarket gauge that does exactly what this other one does for half the price. And it just sometimes, that stuff sketches you out. And you might be wondering, do they suck? So I'm here to talk to you about Glowshift gauges, and are they worth it? Are they worth spending that smaller amount of money rather than just jumping up to the more expensive gauge? So I've been running these gauges in my car since November of 2016. So we're in 2019, so that is 3 years. And they're in my daily as well, let me specify that. They're in my daily, my 2001 Golf. It's a 1.8T, it's not a GTI, but it was my first car I bought to modify, to do things to, and I thought, aftermarket gauges. I want gauges in my car. So I found Glowshift, and I ended up getting a boost gauge, a oil pressure gauge, and an air-to-fuel ratio gauge. Now, the air-to-fuel ratio gauge is a narrow band. Don't ever buy the narrow band. It's no good. It's essentially a $50 gauge that says it'll do what the wideband does, but it doesn't. So steer clear of that. I'm actually probably going to be replacing that gauge with an oil temperature gauge because I have the spot. I don't like things that don't work, but I've just put up with it for 3 years, and I'm just like, let's get something new. The most important one to me was oil pressure, and oil pressure is something that a lot of cars come with from the manufacturer. So oil pressure gauges, been around, they're simple, they just tell you how much oil pressure you have. You have more oil pressure when the car is cold, and the oil pressure goes down as the car gets warmer. And the oil pressure will go up with the RPMs as you drive. So if your car ever loses oil pressure, that's critical. Your engine could be done. If you're driving along and you lose oil pressure and you don't know, and you keep driving, blam, you're done. So with a car with 215,000 miles on it, I prompted to get an oil pressure gauge to monitor that. And the car drops to 20 PSI at idle and will go all the way up to about 90 on a cold start. So that gauge works really well. And something cool that Glowshift offers is they sell a sandwich plate adapter, so you can screw the sandwich plate adapter to where your oil filter goes and then thread your oil filter into that. And then the sandwich plate adapter has a bunch of holes on it that you can hook in Glowshift gauges. So when I go and get the oil temperature gauge, I can literally thread it right in. There's no tapping, there's no drilling, there's nothing. It's like $15 part, and it doesn't leak, and it works seamlessly. So oil pressure is something very nice that all cars should have, but mine didn't, so I went ahead and made it have oil pressure. The next one, and for any car with a turbo, I like to have a boost gauge. Now, a boost gauge monitors your vacuum pressure and your boost pressure, so positive pressure and vacuum. When you're at idle or you're not on the gas, it should be pulling vacuum. You'll notice the gauge is actually below. It's like, it looks like negative, but it's not, it's vacuum. If it has a vacuum leak or it's not pulling any vacuum, the gauge won't go down to 20, or it'll be at like 15, or it'll be at 0, or it's not building any pressure, but it's not pulling any pressure, making vacuum because there's something wrong. So Volkswagens have a lot of vacuum lines, and they tend to go and crack and go bad, so that's something too. If my car wasn't running right and my boost gauge is now not reading the proper vacuum, I have a vacuum leak. Now, I also want it for boost. I rarely even make positive pressure in this car. I almost never going to boost at all in that car, but it's just something to have. And like I said, it was my first car and I really wanted to modify it and make it cool and fast and all that fun stuff. So boost gauge is something you have on the car. Another cool thing about the Glowshift gauges is they have a dimmer effect. So when you go ahead and flip on your interior lights, you wire them in. It's optional. If you don't want to do this, you don't have to, but they are fairly bright. You can wire them in to dim. I think they dim about 50%, so they're not as bright in your face. So at nighttime, you go ahead and dim your gauges, you see them perfectly fine, but they're not blinding you. You also have like 10 colors to choose from. So in my Volkswagen, this car stock has blue numbers and a red needle. And the Glowshift gauge actually has a blue background with a red needle, and it matches absolutely perfectly. But in my Subaru, I have a red gauge cluster. And so I flip my Glowshift gauge in the Subaru to red, and it matches. And then they also have 2 modes where it can just flick between all the colors or fade in between all the colors. So you can actually just have it on this like disco dance mode. It's a little silly, but it's there if you want to do it. And I really think it's a cool feature, so you don't have a gauge that sticks out and it blends and it matches and it looks very nice. So my boost gauge is a mechanical vacuum boost gauge. So there is no electronics controlling the needle or anything like that. It's pure vacuum pressure that makes the needle move. That gauge is only $42. So to have a functioning boost gauge for $42 is very reasonable, and I think it's totally worth the price. The oil pressure gauge is up in the $70 range. That's because it does have a motor and it does read off of a sensor and it has wiring. It's a little more intricate, but it works very well. And it shows my oil pressure and it starts up every single time. I've never had these gauges short. I've never had them go bad, and they read consistently. And I understand it's a status thing, you know, when you buy something expensive versus not expensive, but I feel that at the end of the day, Glowshift gauges are honestly a good purchase for someone like myself who was their first car and they really wanted to modify it, and gauges were something they've wanted and they didn't want to go and spend $150 per gauge. And I just think that's a really good way to start. It's something that's affordable but still works. And I will stand behind my Glowshift gauges and say they haven't broken on me ever. And so, do Glowshift gauges suck? I don't think so. I think they're honestly a good buy for somebody who isn't making 50 pounds of boost, where you do want to monitor it with something a little nicer, you know. But for my Golf, which makes, I couldn't tell you the last time I floored that car, so, you know, 7 to 10 PSI maybe. I think my Glowshift gauge will do just fine. So if you guys have any other questions about Glowshift gauges, or, you know, are curious about anything that I didn't cover, go ahead and drop it down in the comments. I'm happy to answer it. I love answering comments. I just think it's a lot of fun. So thank you guys so much for watching. And if you like these kinds of videos, go ahead and let me know and like the video, because if you want to see other kind of product, real life testing, review kind of videos, let me know, because they're fun to make and I think they're informative and beneficial. So thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, have an awesome day.